Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm just going to kick things off now. I know there's a couple more people coming in, but there's plenty of seats, so just sort of grab a seat and we'll start. So my name is Leo Hickman. I'm the editor of the Carbon Brief website, and we report and sort of publish analysis around both climate science and also energy and climate policies all around the world. Hopefully you've seen our site. And this particular side event is being hosted by Christian Aid and Climate Action Network Latin America and CAN in Europe too. And we've got until about 6:15 to have a discussion with our great panelists, and then we're going to move it over to obviously have some questions from the floor. And just to give a sense of the key theme and what we're going to discuss today, we're going to hear from effectively around the world. We're going to hear some sort of national and regional cases for the shift to renewable energy, and hear some energy sort of narratives and stories from sort of 4 key regions around the world. We're going to trying to identify the challenges and opportunities and the drivers of change towards the ultimate goal, which is obviously a big theme here at the COP, but more generally looking out to the decades ahead, the kind of the zero carbon world. And we're going to discuss ways for closing the current ambition gap, kind of what's currently going on in the world and where we need to be and get that convergence. And whilst doing that, delivering on the sort of the parallel track of the UN, the kind of sustainable development goals, the sustainable energy development. So sustainability, zero carbon as the ultimate destination, but obviously always thinking about the challenges and opportunities of development. So I'm just going to quickly go through our panel before we begin this discussion, and I'm going to start. Well, let's start at the end. So at the far end of on my table, we've got Maeve McLean, who's from Climate Action Network Europe, so giving us the sort of European perspective. Then we've got Wanan Pabilu from the Director of Climate Watch Thailand. Then coming down towards me, we've got Benchen Ariri, the African Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access. And then we've got Roque Padache, sorry, from CAN Latin America, but specifically Argentina. And then finally, we've got Alejandro Alamantraminio, if I said that correctly, hopefully, from Nicaragua. So just to begin the discussion, I'd like to sort of have sort of 2 or 3 open points, really, and for everyone to have a go at answering this question. So if we start, maybe keep this kind of flow going from the end and working down, what are the top 2 or 3 challenges for the shift to low carbon in your particular regions? I want everyone to think about the political, financial, vested interests, and technology. So if we start maybe in Europe, please, Maeve.
Okay, this just works. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so it's quite a broad question, but I think it's good to keep it that way because it gives a wide variety of looking at, as you say, the political, financial, and also the socio-economic challenges. From a European perspective, I think you can see that there is a shift happening. So it's more about what are the challenges to the pace of that shift. I think we're looking at a situation where Europe kind of lagged quite a bit in recent years. Research and development in figuring out and speeding up the pace in which they could develop the technologies to make a shift to renewable energy, and also slowly dragging their feet away from the fossil fuel sector and continued investments in the fossil fuel sector. And I think this is one of the main challenges, is that they see that the European countries, governments are seeing that there's a shift that is happening, but from a civil society perspective, the shift is just not happening fast enough. And I think it's across the board, because we all know, and it's discussed quite widely in the context of these negotiations, about the historical emissions and the historical responsibility of Europe, and therefore, and also the capacity that Europe has in order to make a shift away from fossil fuels and more broadly towards renewable energy. And you can see this in the more recently adopted 2030 framework by the European Union about a year and a half ago, where essentially the targets were below par when it comes to levels of ambition, but also below par when in terms of the technology and the availability and capacity of countries to do more. And when you ask yourself why, it is a combination of things, both politics, finance, and also vested interests. I mean, political will can be lacking sometimes. You've got the substance, you've got the technology, and sometimes it's just that kind of lack of will coming from leaders, where sometimes it's been challenging for a lot of CAN-Europe members across the EU and outside the EU to identify who can be our champions. And we see it in some countries, it kind of peaks and then it wanes a bit. And I think this is just an ongoing trend that we see when it comes to European leadership on climate action and the shift to renewable energy. The other thing is, of course, not taking the low-hanging fruit when it's presented with us, and something that CAN-Europe has started to work on a lot is the issue of fossil fuel subsidies, where, you know, there's still a lot of public and private finance going into the fossil fuel sector. And this is a massive challenge, but yet it's an easy one to overcome. And that's where we really see that, like, this is it's stalling a shift across Europe, but it's also an easy, not entirely easy, but it's one of those things that could be addressed quite quickly. So I think in terms politically, there's that, you know, we want to see more political will coming from our leaders and from the countries, but also looking at the substantive technological advancements. And I think the EU is seeing that it needs to catch up a little bit with the likes of the US and China when it comes to really being a driver in terms of the shift to renewable energy. I'll move. I don't want to take up too much more time on this, but because I think we'll get into more substantive topics about the other areas. But I do think the financial sector has been slightly slower as well in waking up to what needs to be done in terms of the investments and shifting investments away from fossil fuels. Only now we're beginning to see that actually the fossil fuel sector is posing a lot of risks to financial investments, and I think that goes for both public finance and private finance. And I think this is something where our multilateral development banks, private investors, and also public funding, just budgets from governments, are not acting in sync with what the policies are. And I think this is also something that slowed down the shift across Europe. But it's coming around, and I think this is what we're seeking to do, is actually try to speed it up a bit.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to one on, you're from Thailand, but giving your more wider regional perspective, arguably the most populous, is the most populous area of the world, kind of Asia, particularly Eastern Asia. What are the key challenges for your region on this question?
Thank you. I'd like to start with Southeast Asia. That would comprise 11 countries. So, with the trend and coming trend, Southeast Asia is going to invest more on coal-fired power plants, and coal are going to be the biggest source of power. And with that means Southeast Asia is developing quite rapidly. So that in order to respond to the increasing demand, so coal, oil, and gas are going to be the focus of the supply side. So with that, countries, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia are having what is called the Power Development Plan, that is to deal with the power sector. So once you have the Power Development Plan, that would guide you for the installation of the capacity of the power in order to meet increasing demand. So in the Power Development Plan, you would have to look at the demand and the supply, and what kind of power plants are you going to build in the future, like the next 20 to 25 years. So most of the countries having this power development plan, and at the current time, you have the power development plans that would last for the next 20 to 30 years. And if you look at each country's power development plan, you see a number of coal-fired power plants. And renewable energy has been just only the marginalized part of it. And major countries who are also investing more in terms of the coal, that would be Thailand also, and also Vietnam and Indonesia. So we see the challenges in terms of how are they going to move forward into the low carbon society while they are having the power development plan that has been focusing more on coal-fired power plants, even though they have the INDCs and they are committing to the low carbon society. But on the other side, at the implementation level, they are more on coal-fired power plants. So the challenge would be in terms of the political side, whether the government and also the politicians and policymakers are really serious in terms of promoting the low carbon or zero carbon in the power sector. And also, how are they going to support more renewables? So in that case, that would look at the grid and connection and access to the grid, because some of the countries have the grid connected, nearly 100% of the whole country. So in that case, you need each of the household to turn themselves, for example, to have the solar rooftop and also to sell the power produced into the grid. So in that case, the government or the state enterprise who have owned the grid or have the power to the grid, they would need to open the grid. So to have to enhance more access to the grid. That would be one of the challenges. And also in terms of the finance, where would the finance coming from? I think it's more in terms of how would the finance coming from multilateral banks or from loans or as a grant. But I think what needs to be clear is it must not be competing with the finance on other side on other development issues. For example, like it shouldn't be competing with the finance on education, on social services, or on health, or on some other issues in terms of the social. So that would be extra finance to for the promotion of the low carbon power sector. And also the last one, I think I would add onto the a colleague here, that we shouldn't be forgetting about some other issues like the justice issue. You might end up having a very big solar farm, or you might have to have a biofuel, but in that case, you might end up having evicting people out of the land. For example, like large solar farm might evict people or take people out of their land, or you the promotion of renewables like biofuels, but then you are entering into the food and fuel conflicts, for example. So that would have to be looked in terms of the justice issues.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Benson, can you set out the challenges as you see it across, obviously, a huge continent of Africa, many different stories, many different regions within Africa? Can you go through some of those and set it out how you see it?
Okay, thank you so much for the question. I think even before we get to the question of the challenges that probably we are facing in terms of the shift, it would also be important to start by appreciating that there's a shift that has already started in the continent of Africa. And a very good example for me, where we are seated in Morocco, I think it's a country with one of the biggest solar power projects, which for me is an indication. And different across the continent, we have different countries that have some significant initiatives in as far as renewable energy is concerned. However, of course, the shift again is also faced with a number of challenges. And as the speakers have mentioned, cuts across from policy, politics, availability of financial resources to facilitate the shift to renewable energy. And I think one of them, just to mention from a policy stroke political perspective, I think that most of the countries still do not have very clear and facilitative regulatory frameworks that would definitely facilitate or entice the private sector, or even in terms of encouraging the resources that would be that would be required in supporting the transition that is required. And I'll give an example. For example, in Kenya, we have one of the biggest off-grid renewable energy solar power projects that is almost going to be what we call stranded assets, because on the one hand, the government had not introduced some very clear policies, but immediately within a very short time, they changed, and there's this, what is it called? Rural electrification that has been supported by the government, and immediately that has ruled out whatever the investor who had taken the solar project there is concerned. And so it's become a stranded asset, which is not a very good indicator or anything to send signal to the private investors who would otherwise be interested. And so it will be very important for the governments, for example, to come up with very clear policy and regulatory framework that is predictable, that private sectors, for example, who would be interested in investing in the renewable energy projects, that they can be able to work with. And the other thing, in terms of finances, I think there are two key things here. One, there's definitely the perceived high cost of investment in renewable energy, which of course over time has started reducing. But the other thing definitely is that most of the financial institutions, for me, they don't seem to quite understand the renewable energies, the renewable sector very well, in a way they can be able to actually take the risk or the perceived risk in it. And I think, so one of the key things, in my opinion, that needs to be done in the region would definitely be to sensitize and to engage with the private institutions, in this case, the banking institutions, mainly in as far as, for example, the provision of loans to investors who would be interested in providing renewable energy is concerned. Last but not least, I think across the continent, again, we've discovered enough of fossil fuels, so to speak, starting from oil to coal. And I think this is a sector that a majority of the investors, speaking from, for example, even the World Bank, the regional development banks, in this case, the African Development Bank, they see it as a quick area for them to actually provide finances for, either because even the investors are they understand the sector much better, or there's this notion already that that's a quick area that different investors could be interested in looking at. And also, which is a very ugly political conversation, particularly amongst political leaders, you'll hear for them the discussion around transition to low energy, to renewable energy, it's not very clear, especially when in a country that has, for example, discovered, for example, oil. And they say, you know what, the conversation around renewable energy and cleaning the environment, the developed countries messed the environment with their industrialization. And so why should we be held at ransom to progress our economy when we've just discovered oil, for example, or coal? And our interest is to power the continent, our interest is to power our industries. And so what we can be able to quickly capture and make use of, that's what they're looking at. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Benson. That obviously a vital question around, equity, just transition, etc. Moving on to obviously another vital continent of South America, Rocky, would you, not just from the Argentinian perspective, but the continental perspective, just set out some of the challenges as you see it?
Thanks. One of the key issues we have to consider is that in the narrative we hear from the governments, the discourse, there is the wording we want to hear, for example, just transition. But when you go to the INDCs, for example, the targets are completely out of the trajectory we need to get by 2050 with zero carbon, which is what is asked now, and that has been a dramatic change by UNEP and the Council, the Economic Council of the United Nations in Latin America, ICLAC or CEPAL. That means that it's quite clear that it can be done, it's feasible, and even it makes economic sense. So the reason is, or the main reason we don't have the target in NDCs is that still the governments are locked into the old path, and they are looking for investments in the short term, which are actually delivering very little. What they are delivering now is budgetary problems because they need subsidies to be put in place. And they rely on the fact that technology has done its part. And this is why we see quite a lot of investments in particularly electricity in solar PV, for example, or in wind. But on the other hand, the what for and the who benefits is something which is not really being addressed by policies. So, for example, rural electrification or transport electrification, or even the improvement of the urban grids. You see in Latin America, 80% of people live in cities. And you don't see planning for that. It's just left to the market to solve the problem.
Okay, thank you. Alejandro, moving a little bit north to the sort of Central American region, and your experience in Nicaragua, can you set out some of the challenges you see it?
Thank you, Leo. Yes, the context of Central America is a little bit different from South America. Central American countries has established a political framework and a policy framework that promote the transition to low carbon economies, and investments are flowing mainly from private capital. They have also established a ambitious target despite the low level of responsibility or low level of emissions from Central American countries, which is about 0.15% of global emissions. Countries has established in national policies, since our view, very ambitious targets on incorporating renewable or clean energy into the matrix or into the national systems. And they have also made, as said, the transformations in most political, institutional frameworks. What we have seen in Central America is that despite this, and that today most of the electricity being generated in Central America come from renewable sources. More than 50% come from renewable sources. Is that most of investment is being focused on big scale projects that are aimed to generate electricity for the national interconnection system, while we are in a region that we have so many isolated population that is facing situations of poverty. Since our view, energy had a lot to do with adaptation. Even in Central America, energy is more seen since a view of adaptation and resilience than the view on mitigation, so that a population with access to energy totally change or improve their conditions of life. So now the national interconnected systems reach about 80% of the population of Central America. Nevertheless, we have about 20% in average in the region without access that the national interconnection system doesn't reach. And most investment, as I mentioned, has been focused on those big scale projects that privilege that prefer the generation for the big cities, for the industry, and not for the poor people. In this regard, I think one of the main challenges for us as civil society will be to make or to promote the change in the political institutional framework that will promote the investments of small and medium scale systems of generation of energy, mainly for those rural areas that face the highest levels of vulnerability and of poverty in Central America. This will be challenging. Possibly we won't have private capital interested on investing there because of possibly the cost of renewable energies is still high for those peoples. Possibly they can't pay the cost of renewable energy, and then we will need a more active role of the state and the international cooperation to guarantee the access to energy in those isolated populations that are the most vulnerable to climate change, and that energy may help to reduce their vulnerability to climate change. There are so many other challenges, of course, in the region. For example, we have a process of urbanization. The amounts of vehicles, of particular cars in the cities is increasing a lot. So we still need to invest in public transportation. if we don't want to get our transportation system collapsed. Today, cities like Managua, San Salvador, and Tegucigalpa, it takes about 2 hours to run 10 kilometers in the main hours where the people is going to work. And so it generates a lot of impact on the economies because we don't produce oil, we don't have oil. Nevertheless, as the public transportation still is deficient for many people, so many people prefer to use their own cars to go to their works or to mobilize with their families and by themselves. And so this is the area of public transportation will be also a great challenge in Central America. Despite we have great examples in Central America, for example, Costa Rica, they are making a lot of efforts to buy electric buses and to bring some systems of transportations that are more sustainable, that have good quality, that are better. And we can see those examples. Nevertheless, Costa Rica is the country in the region which has the highest level of income per capita, and that has the strong economy. So the cost of more sustainable systems of transportations will be a challenge also. And as said, in the case of the system of electricity, we will need more intervention from the governments as well as from international institutions like the Inter-American Bank of Development, like the World Bank, etc., so that we can deal with these problems, and that are not only problems of climate change or decarbonization. We have health problems in our cities because of the increasing of emissions, and this is a problem that is affecting all of us there in the region.
Thank you very much. So that was a pretty quick tour around the world, and obviously many issues came up there. Maybe before we move on to talk about finance, investment, how do we, move the money towards this transition towards zero carbon world? I'd just like to come back. I know many people on this panel have already mentioned it, but the issue of energy poverty is obviously a hugely significant element of this story. And we hear sometimes, tales about, the need to, leapfrog certain mistakes that some developed countries have already made. But that sounds great, but I'd like to hear some actual detail about how you tackle energy poverty and move to a zero carbon world at the same time. Maybe one on you'd like to start from the sort of the Asian perspective of how you tackle these twin challenges.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think from experiences of Laos, Cambodia, and the southern part of Thailand, they've been implementing the off-grid system, like mini hydro, which is less than 5 megawatts, and also the solar rooftop community. And those are kind of the off-grid system. So I mean, that is, you are giving the people with the access to the electricity, to the power, and the benefit has come from that. Just people have more time, rather than more time, and also the health, more time for their children to go to school. They can make some of the work or the living at home or within their community because they are electrified, they have the power, and they can install some of the electrical appliances that would need to improve their health, like their food. They can store more food and things like that. So in terms of the benefit, because of the low carbon initiative and also the system that they are implementing. So I mean, a number of these kind of things that you are providing to those people who are off the grid. So benefits are quite clear, and also you are providing people with the access to the power that they don't really have before. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Benson, in Africa, we I've seen and read about many case studies over the years in Rwanda, etc., where the move to try and move away from highly centralized electricity distribution. Can you please set out some of your own examples of how the need to tackle energy poverty can also deliver the zero carbon goals?
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the question. I think first and foremost is basically just appreciating what's the problem in as far as energy is concerned, or energy poverty is concerned in Africa. And for me, I think the first thing is basically recognizing the place of energy in terms of just opening opportunities and potential for the African poor people. And Africa is actually one of the most one of the continents. I mean, it's one of the continents without the potential for, I mean, without energy, especially to its people. 600 million people across the continent have got no access to electricity. Around 600,000 people annually, from statistics, they die from in-house air pollution as a result of the poor energy sources that they use. And that for me paints a clear picture why we need to quickly venture in, and why we have to actually provide a solution as quick as possible. The beauty about it is, again, as I had mentioned in my opening remarks, is that most governments across the continent, they are keen in terms of providing energy. But the question again is, for me, it's not about just generation, but it's also distribution, and basically taking energy to the people who have got no access, those people who are far off the grid, who are actually a majority across the continent. And for me, off-grid, for example, many off-grid power projects provide the solution. And the beauty about it is most of these actually could be renewable energy projects. And I'll give a case, for example, in Kenya. Rwanda, again, as you've mentioned, and across even in Mali, for example, we have a number of projects, both solar powered, that are off-grid. And the beauty about it is decentralizing power. It's not as costly as a centralized source of energy, or the centralized source of power. And so it's both clean, that you can be able to provide solar powered within those remote communities, but at the same time is that you're also providing energy to the people who have got no access to energy. But also, number two, other than just the off-grid, is that, again, as I had mentioned, Africa has huge potential for renewable energy, speaking from solar energy, geothermal, wind, and the more investors continue to come in, the more governments continue to put in place policies and regulations that actually facilitate the investment in the sector. It becomes a win-win situation, hence the conversation around the leapfrogging. And because Africa, as you're saying, right now we require huge amounts of energy to power the economic transformation that is required in the continent, and also just to power, to power different households. And so it becomes a critical thing to see how can we be able to leapfrog, so that, again, we do not tie ourselves into the dilemma of dirty energy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Maybe we should, just keeping an eye on the time, maybe we should talk about financing this transition. How do we avoid some of the mistakes that have been made before in terms of moving finance away from sort of dirty energy production into some of the zero carbon solutions we've already been talking about? And who and how should that be paid for? And who should be making those investments? Is it governments? Is it development banks? Is it private money? Maybe if we go to the end, Maeve, you can tackle this question first, the kind of the all-important money question.
Okay, so yeah, I think this is where it's kind of a combination of where public policy comes in, and where you need a bit of certainty from governments and from policies and regulations to kind of drive investments away from that dirty energy in the first place. And so that's where you need ambition. It's where you need a kind of a longer term projection, and I think not just in Europe, but everywhere we advocate for a long term goal towards knowing that our investments that are made now are not going to have a negative impact in the future. And that's part of policies now. But it's also engaging with financial actors that are also trying to promote infrastructure projects, large-scale transport projects that will see that their investments that are made today are going to have a lasting impact in 30 years' time. And I think it takes a much more detailed dialogue, and not just about like your projected reductions in emissions and also your increase in renewable energy, but also about like the demand for the kinds of energy that we want to be seeing. And so if you've got stronger policies that are anchored down now, that can be strengthened in the years to come, then you're going to ideally see that people will want less fossil fuels and be engaging more with energy savings, energy efficiency, and also there's going to be more renewable energy coming into the mix. And I think investors need to see those signals as well. When you look at financial institutions in Europe, I don't think they're quite there yet. I don't think they're really seeing that this is the future that needs to happen, and this is the future that should be inevitable. And part of that is kind of like there's a misalignment. From maybe a personal perspective, I think that their scenarios don't really match up with what needs to happen. And I think therefore they see still a future for fossil fuels where civil society and many local communities don't see a future. And so I think there's much more in-depth discussion needs to happen to say and to illustrate and to discuss, okay, we want a world that doesn't get warmer than 1.5 degrees. And what does that really mean for the investments that we make now? Mm-hmm. And I think then you could have a bit more of a broader discussion about how do we remove the barriers to then expand and speed up a transition that can really increase the share of renewable energy and also energy savings and things like that. I think another thing that is interesting to note, and it is kind of the geopolitics of it as well, and what is in the interests of countries, not just in terms of air pollution, but also on dependence. I think it was mentioned, if you don't have your own indigenous supply of energy, I also don't want to be dependent on other countries, especially in volatile areas. And so I think it's a kind of aside from the climate discussion, but it's also about how you can ensure that your people, your citizens, can turn the lights on without relying on something that's completely volatile and essentially unreliable. And I think that comes into the fore more, and where you can make the argument, well, then that's where you save energy, you increase your plans to improve energy efficiency. And that should ideally drive the sectors in a way that kind of gives it a bit more robust and sound pathway. And yeah, I think that's probably the crux of it from the side of our work, at least.
Okay, Alejandro, how do we make the shifts in the finance and the money, and how does it get presented as a positive opportunity rather than a risk? How do we make that transition in mindset amongst investors?
Yes, I think it will depend on the possibilities of influencing public policies, so that, as mentioned before, public policies are aimed to promote the participation of the private sector, while the access of energy, since our view, is more a matter of adaptation. And then we need to provide, to deliver services of clean energy mainly to those sectors that are more vulnerable, that are in isolated areas of the region. And possibly private sector will be not interested in those areas because of the cost of renewable energy is still high, and the scale of the project to provide energy to those communities are too small to the interests of the private sectors. So again, we will need a more active role of the government, multilateral organizations, and access also to funding from the financial mechanisms that the International Agreement on Climate, in this case, the Paris Agreement, may generate to provide clean energy to those populations, because of private sector as the institutional framework has been designed today. I don't believe it will provide energy to the most poor and the most vulnerable people from Central America. There are other aspects also that need a more active role of the state. which is and has to do with energy, which is, for example, the technologies of the kitchens to cook the food, and to how to use the firewood. We still have a very efficient cooking systems. Nevertheless, we need to strengthen the regional programs so that efficient technologies to cook the food or to improve the kitchens can be delivered to local communities. And it has to do also with resilience, because of it has to do with the level of degradation of the ecosystem, of the services that the ecosystemical services that forests provide to communities, which is also adaptation. Most communities in rural areas take sources of energy from forest. So improving the efficiency of the technology that they use to use the energy will be also important. And this is a matter that, despite all the countries has their firewood strategies, in most cases, additional financial resources to implement what they have said they will do in those strategies is needed. So financial resources from public sources will be an important aspect in this regard.
Okay. Rocky, I want to move on to the subject of social license. How do you bring the people with you on this journey towards zero carbon? How does civil society, campaigners, etc., make the case that this is the journey worth going on? We can maybe not rely on politicians, maybe not rely on investors, but you've got to have the people, you've got to have the mandate from the people to go on this journey. Can you please begin that discussion and sort of point out what the challenges are there for this crucial issue of the mandate of the people?
Usually, what you see in the fight against fossil fuel extraction is that there is no obvious link between the local impacts and the general policies, in this case, particularly climate policy. But that is actually changing. And we see that when specific policies are discussed at the national level, the parliament, for example. We have different examples, but particularly interesting was the glaciers defense protection movement, which initially was just related to an anti-mining campaign, but then it became a part of the climate campaign. And the same can be said with regards to fracking, for example. There's quite a strong campaign, which is mostly led by people who are feeling the pressure because of local impacts. But it initially, but then it comes into a national-wide claim for specific policy against fracking and against any no new fossil policy, which is needed for any kind of realistic climate policy.
Okay. Wanan, can you give us the sort of perspective on this issue of how you bring the people with you on this journey? How do you make the case to the public and get them to force the change that needs to happen from the perspective of Southeast Asia?
So for the recent case that we have done with the campaign is for Thailand and Indonesia. That was the biggest one of the biggest coal-fired power plant to be built in the southern part of Thailand in a touristic area in Phuket, in Krabi province, and also in central Java in Indonesia. We call that campaign is the power for whom. So the large power plant is not going to be, if you have the power plant next to your door or in your own area, it doesn't necessarily mean that even you are located next door, you will be connected and using the power produced by that power plant. It will be connected to the grid, and then it will be shared to it will get into the national capacity. So in that case, we show in terms of the number and the figures that the power, the electricity that is produced by that power plant, who is actually using it. So in that case, the power that is produced is actually for whom? And then we found out that there was, if you have been in Thailand before and in Bangkok, you would know Mabun Krong department store or Siam Center. So we have 2 coal-fired power plants outside Bangkok in the rural area that is producing power just to respond to the need of the 2 department stores in Thailand, in Bangkok. So in that case, people are seeing in terms of who are really using the power. Why are they having the power plant in our backyard? So in that case, we link that to the solution that the coal is not needed. So and then what is needed rather than coal? Then in that case, you promote more in terms of the low carbon and also more renewables, both off-grid and also on-grid. So that's how we trying to engage with the people. But then you have a problem as well. What is renewables? What is the solar? And people seem to know that is solar, the energy from the sun and from the wind. Where do we get more information, more technical things out of it? It's not yet there in the market. So you start to pick up and trying to make a dot and a link and a map that there are off-grid systems here and there, here and there. This is kind of something to get people to know where the power is coming from the sun and where they can get the information out of it. So people start to get more involved and also more understanding on renewables. So that's how we're starting to get people to support in terms of the campaign.
Okay, before we just go and hear some reaction and questions from the floor, Benson, can you just give us your perspective and experience on this question of what role campaigners, civil society do and can do in Africa in terms of persuading people this zero carbon destination is worth making the journey towards?
Thank you. I think civil society organizations have a critical role to play in as far as transition is concerned. And not just about transition alone for me. I look at both transition and also ensuring that energy is made accessible to the people, to the millions of African people who actually have got no access to energy. And I think the first bit in any campaign, you will be told it's a question of mobilization. And the best person who's at the best place to do mobilization is civil society organizations who over time have built trust and confidence amongst the people they've been working with, who are mainly the poor and the affected communities. And so I think for me, that's the first appreciation. But also number two, as I had mentioned, that across the continent, for example, a majority of people have got no access to energy. And the first thing, again, linked to the same, for example, is the number of deaths that I spoke about, the 600,000 annually from estimates who die from, for example, in-house air pollution, which again is linked to the poor sources of energy, for example, for cooking. And so if you try to paint a picture, for example, one, that these guys have got no access to energy and hence the deaths, for example, and hence, for example, the locked entrepreneurship opportunities, which if energy was made available, would definitely trigger that the enterprise opportunity. Then they would see why this conversation around energy, how it affects them, number one. And number two, if, for example, they were given energy, how does that open the opportunities to fight poverty or to actually get themselves away from poverty is concerned? And that's how you build the interest amongst them. And for me, the moment you mobilize and they get to understand where they come in, then the conversation around some of these retrogressive policies that do not provide the opportunity for them to be linked to energy can be handled. Whether, for example, it's an issue about public-private partnership that would then, for example, open the opportunities for private investors to provide energy in the rural communities, either as an mini-grid or whatever source would be very central. And as I had mentioned, I think for me, my understanding in the African context is that centralized energy is very costly from the onset, and that's the reason why a majority of the poor people do not have access to it. And so if you provide decentralized energy, which again could be very clean, for example, solar, as I had mentioned, would be a central place or a central opportunity to provide energy that is clean. to the rural communities. And that's where civil society organizations for me come in. And of course, in terms of reviewing policies and regulatory framework, who again does the policy and advocacy, I mean the campaigning work. It's the civil society organizations, and again, working hand in hand with the people. You cannot be able to influence policy alone, unless, for example, it's in the cases of lobbying, where, for example, you can be able to lobby directly. But for impactful policy influencing, then you definitely need to have the numbers behind you, and you cannot leave people behind. But you have to paint the picture why they have to be involved in the process and why it's actually helpful for them in the long run.
Okay, great. So we've heard from the panel, but I'd really like to, before we move to actual questions, I'll ask you just to reserve your questions just for 1 second. I'd like 2 people just to respond to what the panel have been explaining to us. And I'd like to start with Jill Duggan, who's Director of Policy from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. So, grab the microphone.
Thank you. And I'll just give you a little bit of background on me, because I've been the Director of Policy at Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership since June and Director of the Corporate Leaders Group. But my background is partly in UK government and the European Commission as a policymaker on climate and energy, and then also in industry, working as a policy director for a company that made its money previously from coal boilers. And a lot of the very interesting work I've done is how they see the future and how they've now adjusted what they think they need to do. Last year, and I think there's synergies for all areas, last year they undertook, I've been talking to them about climate change for quite a long time, and they hadn't paid very much attention, but eventually they did. And they undertook to do some scenarios of what they thought the market would look like for them in 2030. And they came up with 4 scenarios, which they thought were possible. One was a distributed generation high carbon. One was distributed generation low carbon. One was centralized high carbon, which was their comfort zone of where they'd made money in the past. And one was centralized decarbonization. And they started off with those scenarios having equal possibilities, and then they kind of tracked what was happening in the world and what they thought where the direction of travel was. And very quickly, they started to understand that the direction of travel, whether you're in Europe or Africa or South America, is towards decentralized low carbon generation, because it's the only way you start to solve some of the problems that you need to. You don't get transmission losses if you don't have a big grid. And actually, as they would say, would you invent a grid if you didn't have one? So one of the problems that Europe has, and it might seem like a sort of problem of success, is we've got declining demand for energy in general, and a general acceptance that we need to move in order to deal with some of the problems that we have, to move from a centralized system of energy supply to a decentralized or regionalized system of energy supply. And therefore, at the moment, we've got governments who are trying to persuade companies to invest in big projects and having to offer quite a lot of incentive to do that, because your market understanding is telling you that that's not what's required. You need small, decentralized generation, and you need to move away from fossil. So there's a problem, again, for policymakers, is that they're probably on a slightly different path, or politicians a different path, to where the industry understands the market is going. And some bits of that industry will be in denial, and some bits of it will be lobbying to try and retain its position of comfort. But I think all of them probably understand the direction of travel now. It's taken a long time to understand the direction of travel. So that's just sort of on the energy thing. On the general shift, as director of the Corporate Leaders Group, we have 24 companies who are progressive leaders on climate change. These are companies that are the sort of companies that there will be some of them here at the COP. They're not the many, many, many small and medium-sized enterprises that probably have no idea that we're meeting here this week, and really haven't, because their business is making money out of whatever they're doing. It's not paying attention necessarily to the big policy debates. So what I've observed in the companies that I've worked with is that it takes leadership, actually. It's usually down to an individual as well. There may be a policy nudge, but it's down to an individual who then decides that they want and it's not about decarbonizing their company. That might be part of it, but what they want to do is they want to future-proof their company so it will continue to be relevant and make money in a world to which we're moving, and that therefore it's about hedging their future by taking action. And part of that action will be initially what you see is you see companies looking to decarbonize what they do, and then with progressive companies they start to actually step back from it and re-engineer what they do or diversify into other sectors, because that's the way that you get that innovation. So I think, I mean, I'm not giving you any solutions here, but I'll give you some observations that some of these problems and some of them, the solutions are the same the world over, although the circumstances look very, very different. There are not 600 million people in Europe without access to electricity, but there are some of the same problems for policymakers in actually getting this shift happening. And there's the same requirement, I think, for civil society. So one of the things I hear from the companies I work with, progressive companies, is they get no benefit from public recognition of what they're doing. So they can do the right thing. They can see that they're future-proofing. They're persuading their shareholders it's the right thing. These are big companies and big, important CEOs who can do it. But they're getting no public recognition. And we have to accept that whilst they're getting no public recognition, and whilst small and medium-sized enterprises don't understand this debate or what they've got to do and where they've got to move, that we have failed. We need to keep finding different ways of engaging with the public and with companies that don't come to the COP and don't have public affairs departments and government affairs departments to understand what this is. But the solutions are actually, they will evolve over time, and they require leadership and vision, and they require imagination and creativity. But actually, to get those things happening and to get businesses seeing that, we've got to engage with them and get that story across.
Okay, thank you, Jill. At the other end of, we've heard about corporate leadership. I'd quite like to hear a perspective from the end of sort of unions and workers and the employees. So if I can hand over to Benjamin Dennis from the European Trade Union Confederation to your reaction, what you've heard from the panel.
Thank you. Thank you for having invited the ETUC and the trade union movement to participate to the event. And thank you for all the interesting presentations. Indeed, I'm struck by the fact that despite the wide variety of circumstances, contexts, there are many lessons which are quite familiar to what we are doing as trade unions on these issues. I would like to mention a project we just completed a few weeks ago, which is about climate policies in industrial regions in Europe. This project is made of 7 case studies, 7 regional case studies. We selected regions which still highly rely on activities which are CO2 intensive activities. We went to these regions, we discussed with local trade unions, but also with local authorities, local employers, the opportunities and the challenges related to the transition towards a low and even a zero carbon economy. And basically the main conclusions we got from that tour of Europe are the following. The first one is that we absolutely need to bring the states back in. We need leadership from public authorities because we need policy planning. And in Europe, the current situation is that we have indeed a few policy instruments, one of them being a market-based instrument. And the basic assumption is that all the changes will trickle down from this market-based mechanism. And what we see when we visit those regions, the regions where the emissions reductions are supposed to take place, we see that indeed there are a series of very interesting initiatives. Some changes, we can see windmills happening in ports. We see solar panels on the roofs of the storage buildings, etc. But it's not enough to transform these regions into zero carbon regions in a few decades. So we need something else, and the first step is policy planning, of course, at national level, but also at subnational level, at regional level, to better steer the transition towards a low carbon economy. The second key conclusion is that we need to enhance social dialogue, participation. Of course, all the stakeholders, given the scope of the challenges ahead, must have their say in the discussion. But for what relates to the labor market, we think that social partners, so employers and trade unions, workers' representatives, should be much more involved in the discussion. What does that mean for my region, which still highly depend on coal, to move to a low carbon economy in a few decades? What does that mean for my workers? What does that mean for my community? What kind of policy instruments do we need to accompany people from the existing economy, from the existing jobs towards the economy we would like to see? Third element, there is a skills and education agenda. If you shift the economy, you will need maybe to update skills, maybe to change completely the skill profile of your workers. And again, this requires an action from public authorities. We also need, obviously, to avoid to believe that the public support is granted. Public support shouldn't be taken for granted. We have seen that a couple of hours ago. We say that because when we go to regions which combine a series of social challenges and a high dependence on coal, for instance, we see that the mood is not at all appropriate, I would say, to accept the need for a change, the need to move towards a low carbon economy, because the transition will not happen in a social vacuum. Many workers have experienced in recent past massive restructuring processes, pressure on wages, attempts to dismantle social protection systems, attacks against the ability of workers to negotiate collective agreements, etc., etc. In such a context, do you seriously believe that these workers will be enthusiastic about a series of policy instruments which will be, at least in the short term, detrimental to their economy, to their community, the community they belong to? So again, we need to accompany the core energy and climate policies with a wide set of social and labor market instruments. Otherwise, climate change policies will be seen as detrimental to employment, will be seen as drivers to increase social inequalities, and we will end up in a sort of populist impasse where the resistance, the reluctance to the transition will be extremely difficult to avoid. And so we say, give a social face to the transition towards a low carbon economy. This is what we call a just transition, and this is extremely important. And maybe one last word to address the question about financing, and this is also about the social context. If we continue with a situation where big companies pay less taxation than you and I, first, we deprive public authorities from the money which would be necessary to invest in, for instance, the development of railway networks, public transport network, the money which would be necessary to improve the insulation of social housings, all these things. And second element, it will increase again the perception that we live in a society where poor people are always, on all aspects, all subjects, the losers of the choices which are made by our politicians. So one message, if we want to succeed in reaching, in transforming our economy into a low carbon economy, don't forget jobs, don't forget employment, don't forget social justice and the social dimension.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think the events of this week in the US have pretty much summarized what you've said. If you're setting off on a just transition, if it is not just and it's disorderly and you leave people behind and people don't feel like they're benefiting from this transition, you get the kind of political outcome that has just happened in the US, I suspect. Okay, we have about 15 minutes maybe for questions from the floor. It's good to see a few hands. I'm going to go to the gentleman on the aisle at the back. I think it was the first hand I saw. And just to obviously stress, as always in these things, just a succinct question rather than a point, just a very quick question for the panel, please.
Conrado Surber, Interandes from Peru. My question to Alejandro and to Roque is about distributed energy. The issue the lady told about being decentralized energy, because Europe has done some steps in this direction, but in Latin America, we don't see any progress on this matter. And this is the kind that consumers got their own energy. It creates jobs, and it's a way to the solar future. But perhaps the regulations are not here, or the power of the large companies is too heavy. And in the case of Nicaragua, I'm wondering about this large new Panama Canal being built there, if the finance of this project could be, let's say, distributed to solar energy in the kind of distributed energy. Thanks.
Okay, some excellent kind of precise regional questions. And maybe Alejandro, do you want to?
Yes, just to see if I understood your question. Thank you for the question. You mean why we don't see the centralized systems of producing energies in the case of Central America? This is your question, right? Okay, yeah. I think there are vested interests. Of course, institutional frameworks has been done to be in favor of big companies, to attract big capitals. And that's why sometimes it's really difficult to have small scale and medium scale projects in communities. Again, this seems my view, even we are in favor inclusive of that the people may generate their own energy through photovoltaic systems, etc. But the national law, at least in Nicaragua, doesn't permit it. In most countries from Central America, there are barriers for the people to generate their own energy, because it will affect the profits of some big companies investing in this big projects. So the issue of autonomous, of the autonomy of the people on generating their energy will be a challenge also in Central America. Because of that reason, it's only what is happening, and mobilization of the people will be important. Creating awareness on the people will be important, and providing the information so that general social pressure can be over the people that take decisions in Central America.
With regards to distributed energy, you see that most of the governments are betting on centralized, because it's where the easy money, the low-hanging fruit is, and they don't care if there is a lot less jobs to be requested for this transition. And this is a big problem, because you don't get into the learning curve that you need to get those costs going down. It's easier for them to go for centralized big megawatts and using that energy in the grid, so that it can be used for mining or any other concentrated demand. Whereas on the other house, they would have to think about social housing, of changing the ways, the weak grids, which is a real big problem in urban Latin America, is solved. So it's basically a problem of how you think, or how the government, or how the state, or how the society think that you will see the end of the picture. The lady Jill, I think, said how you can imagine a more democratic society, and certainly decentralized is more democratic, not just because you're given the prosumers an opportunity to do something, but also because there is a more intervention in general of social, of just plain people.
Okay. Yeah, the lady here.
Good evening, everyone. Dayina Shegar from Civil Society, Mauritania. So it's very interesting to hear that the international community is talking about how to switch from a fossil fuel-based world to a more clean energy fueled world. But the main question here is how to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. Worldwide, we know that there are countries setting the stage for a good transition, especially in Europe, Germany and northern countries, but there are other countries who are really still going with the status quo, mainstream. You know, the question here, how to switch policies, how to stop subsidizing the people who are really causing the dramatic increase of CO2 worldwide by stopping subsidizing and making the world a fair ground for green, clean energies to really fill the gap and play the role they're supposed to play in development. Thank you.
Okay, who would like to tackle that question? Anyone with a particular perspective on shifting subsidies? Yeah, Maeve?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're learning as we're working on subsidies across developed countries, at least in Europe, across US, Canada, etc., is that they're coming in many forms, and actually that there's not a normalized understanding or a mainstream knowledge of subsidies and the fact that they come out of taxpayers' pockets. And I think this is a starting point for a lot of organizations, is actually we need to start informing and educating people that this is a clear problem, that there's money been taken from one pocket, your citizens, and put into another, generally the industry. And so this is the first start, and also making the economic arguments. I mean, some say, okay, right, there's a low oil price, that's the starting point for removing a subsidy, but of course it's like, how do you maintain it, and how do you show that you need to internalize much better the cost of burning fossil fuels? And this is what's not happening. And it's really it can be challenging when there is a lack of leadership to show we need to actually have a proper price on carbon, because otherwise it makes everything difficult, because subsidies are a negative carbon price, and therefore you're undoing a lot of the progress that you're making. And so I think it's a case of educating the broad spectrum of citizens and public sector, as well as also showing what the solutions are in terms of the economic benefits from doing it. And so it's a work in progress, I think, and it'll keep happening as once countries start showing a bit of leadership and removing certain subsidies, it'll happen, but it's definitely happening a bit too slow in my opinion, at least.
Okay, thanks, Maeve. Wenon?
Just a small word to add onto that. I mean, we did something just to show the people and the public why a power plant is needed. Once a power plant is needed, then you would need to go for subsidies. So in that case, we show in terms of like the power plant, the power development plan, in the plan of the government to go for more coal-fired power plants, then it's not needed because it can be responded by others, by other alternatives. And one of the biggest one and the cheapest cause is energy efficiency and energy saving. So in that case, you don't really need to do subsidy for the fossil fuel, because it can be responded by other alternatives. So we are showing the people that there are a number of alternatives. And one of the cheapest costs is the energy efficiency and energy savings. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Let's go for a question over here. Gentleman, the hand up there.
Hi, my name is Kiel Kühne from the Leave It in the Ground initiative, Lingo. And when we talk about fossils and clean energy, we often tend to think that more clean energy means less fossils. But actually what's happening in many countries is an all of the above energy strategy. Even in countries like Germany, we have so much clean energy coming online. At the same time, we keep the lignite mines going. And as far as my perception goes, most countries work that way. And if we look at the Paris Agreement, the amount of carbon that we can put out there is only about 20% of proven reserves, even less. But at the same time, we are still looking for much more oil, coal, and gas. So most governments are pushing that. The energy strategy is to increase fossil supply. So my question is, given that all of us are here worrying about the climate, I would say thinking that the Paris Agreement and its ambition is the way forward, how can we stop governments and companies for putting billions, as is currently happening, in looking for more fossil fuels?
Thank you. I mean, Benson, maybe, I mean, just off the top of my head, I'm kind of thinking now of South Africa, you know, a country that has made renewable investments, but also obviously has, you know, big fossil fuel reserves and is looking in that direction as well. Do you maybe want to take on that question first?
Yeah, sure. I can make an attempt. I think last year when we committed ourselves to the Paris Agreement and its commitment, I think that was, for me, the first step in terms of painting what direction both the investors as well as governments should be pointing their investment in as far as energy is concerned. And I think one of the most important thing then would be, even from processes like these COPs that we usually attend every year, is coming up with very strict mechanisms, for example, even through the carbon pricing, that would definitely discourage any investor, whether in terms of provision of subsidies, whatever institution, whether the African Development Bank, for example, the World Bank, if it's a particular country, for example, that is investing, putting some investment, for example, in exploration of coal, how can we be able to make the process very punitive that it discourages, other than even, for example, considering what my sister mentioned about doing the case for the economic benefit of investing in less carbon intensive energy sources. I think for me, it would be making sure that you make the investment becomes very, very costly for the companies or countries that would be interested in exploring in fossil fuels.
Okay, Rocky, that responding to the question there, this idea that how do you stop the all of the above investments and focus just on the zero carbon energy?
Well, the easy answer is to just shift subsidies, because most of these mining operations and fossils need subsidies, as has been explained before. And we see the countries that have bet heavily, such as, for example, Brazil. They ended with the Petrobras scandal and a very serious financial crisis because of this. Venezuela also in crisis. Ecuador also in crisis. And not just because of the price of oil, but the fact that they are moving the economy in that sense. And the same for other countries, that they need to move. If they cannot avoid a certain amount of subsidies for social reasons, which is arguable, at least they have to make the level playing field. And that makes absolute sense, even from a neoclassical point of view. So that would be the easy thing to do. And in terms of jobs, it's quite clear that there will be a win. Of course, as our friend has said, you have to take care of the people who will, at least for a while, lose their jobs, because there are some detrimental things. But when you see the whole picture, it's very clear that the working class as a whole is a winner.
Okay. Question at the back on the aisle.
Sorry, my name is Faustina Boachi from Ghana. All this issue about fossil fuel, and I thought he was going to talk about what I wanted to say. But then I know that gas is a fossil fuel, but as far as cooking is concerned, it's also the cleanest type of fuel for cooking. If I'm wrong, the scientists and others here should correct me. I'm talking from a lame person's point of view. If that is the case, then we have problems in areas where LPG is being promoted a lot. How do you answer that if we want to do away with fossils and then go to renewables? In Africa too, the use of renewables, if it's for cooking, is an issue. Because we use big pots, we cook a lot, our fires are supposed to be stronger. How do we use, if it's not LPG, how do we use solar, for example, for cooking the kinds of foods we eat? So there are big issues there. And I'm happy you talked about decentralized, smaller projects and all that. Oh, I'm just coming from the Africa renewable energy initiative, and it's billions and billions, and projects are going to be 1 billion. And I know that the poor people are not going to benefit from this project. So I got up from there and left. I didn't need to continue listening to all the big figures they were mentioning, because I know the poor woman in my village will not benefit anyway, because they are thinking about big electricity projects and all that. And so there's a conflict here, and I don't know what to do. Thank you.
So there a lot in that question, and a brilliant question in many ways, and it kind of actually raises this topic we haven't really discussed. So we've, on this road towards zero carbon, we often hear about these bridge technologies. You know, should we use gas to use as a bridge to move us away from the very dirtiest fossil fuels? Should we rely on arguably less dirty fossil fuels to help us move this transition? Does anyone want to tackle this question? Okay, Rocky.
I think you can have a general answer for that, because in almost all cases, at least, if you go for gas, you will lock into a trajectory that will go beyond 2050, and we need to be zero by 2050. So that would be the physical, easy answer.
Okay. Alejandro?
Yeah, in Central America, we also cook a lot and eat a lot, so it's a very complicated issue. What we have been promoting is the use of more efficient technologies for cooking. For example, kitchens that use 30% of the firewood that the old kitchens have been using. And so it's also a way to protect the ecosystems and the forest. Nevertheless, we must recognize that we have also cultural barriers, so that people in Central America, usually normal families, want to see the fire in the kitchens. So when using more new technologies, we don't see the fire because of are very closed, so that the head can be kept there. So it's really challenging. And as Roque has said, this is a matter of I think when we see that there are no forests, possibly when the ecosystems has collapsed, possibly we will have a more awareness on the need of change our culture, and on the need of taking all those things in mind. But of course, it is a very complicated issue.
May a more refined one?
Okay, Rocky, just to come back on what you said before, and then we'll move to Benson.
Yeah. A second order answer would be that you have to prove that there is no technical solution better than gas. For example, to go for biogas as an interim solution, to go for electrification, and essentially to go for something which is more related to sufficiency. How much do you need for the final purpose? That the old story of final use. And when you've done all that, then you see for how long you need this natural gas be the way it is. But just jumping into a natural gas infrastructure that will be there for decades is the worst solution.
Okay, Benson.
Thank you. I think Alejandro has actually responded to what I wanted to mention. The issue of the alternatives, in which case biogas for me immediately just came into my mind. But also linked to the same, I fully understand what you mean by Africans loving cooking and being energy intensive. But I think for me, the conversation again has started tilting towards energy efficiency, which is something that we definitely have to think about energy efficiency, and it's really happening. But just mentioning again, reacting to your frustration about the African renewable energy initiatives, and for example, even the African Development Bank's initiative on the energy for Africa. It's something for me that has also really concerned me big time in terms of who's going to benefit out of this. Is it your traditional industries, for example, or the traditional people who are served by the national grid? And when the conversation is actually supposed to actually also move away from just your traditional person to the people who are totally off the grid. In this case, now the communities who are totally off the grid. And that's where, for me, the issue about campaigning comes in. And that's where the role of the civil society organizations in terms of mobilizing and advocating for facilitative policies that would definitely support delivery of energy to these poor people is concerned.
Okay. We're going to lose this room in 2 minutes. So I've got just enough time for one very short question and then one very quick answer. So the gentleman in the middle, please.
Sean Swinney with Unions for Energy Democracy, also with the trade union community like Benjamin. I think it was mentioned a couple of times about bringing the state back in. And I think we really have to develop that narrative is the states should not be playing the role that the World Bank says they should, which is purely sending signals, purely sort of offering incentives, entering into public-private partnerships, arranging power purchase agreements. We have seen over the last 20 years the barest growth, really. If you look at the proportion of the whole of renewable power globally, it's still only a few percent when compared to the entire power generation system. Modern renewables. If you take hydro out of the picture, it's still very low. And the reason why it's low is because of the privatization and liberalization of electricity markets. So the question is, I think, if we're going to talk about the state coming back in, we have to be more critical of these market mechanisms. And I would urge everybody to avoid this herd effect when it comes to looking into certain policies and thinking that they are tried and trusted and succeeding. If we look at the data, they're not succeeding.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone want to come back on that point? Alejandro?
Yeah, totally agree. I think that the responsibility that we are giving to the private sector is too high. We need the states again in the sector, and we also need public financing from the international mechanism of financing. In this case, the one of the Paris Agreement, we hope that we will scale the 100 million, and that part of that will be directed to the energy sector so that the transformations that we need can be done in our countries. If we give it to the market, of course, the market will possibly be part of the solution, but they won't give us all the solutions that we are needing here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, well, right on time, but we are going to lose the room. So I just want to thank, obviously, our host, which is Christian Aid and Climate Action Network, and more importantly, our wonderful panel. But thank you very much. It was a great debate. Thank you.